Right then, this is AQA Psychology, this is aggression, media influences on aggression, and including computer games. If you're following in your booklet, this is pages 26, 27 and 28, the description element. And the big question here is, does the media, these things on this list, computer games, films, TV and so on, does watching violent computer game films, TV, computer games and so on, does that cause us to be aggressive? It's a big question that's been debated in the media lots of times and under lots of different situations, but that's the big question that we're looking at. And in particular, does playing violent computer games mean you're more likely to go away and be aggressive or more violent in real life? So let's look at what we know from research. First of all, we know that we learn through the process of social learning, where we observe models and then we may be motivated to reproduce behaviours performed by those models depending on what the consequences were. So we know that already, that if we see an aggressive model doing an aggressive behaviour and being rewarded for it, we're more likely then to go away and copy it. So we know that already, that social learning happens. Another thing that research has shown is that when we watch, for example in a film, an aggressive act, we learn what we call a script, which is stored and then can be triggered and reenacted at a later date. And that means that it's a certain kind of scenario that we watch, and if elements of that scenario are then present later, it means that that may trigger that script, and we may then go and reenact the same scenario that we saw in a film. And research suggests this is a cognitive element, something that happens as a result of watching violent TV. Whether we reproduce the violence or not, or the aggression, is affected by several things. So one thing is whether the aggression is real or fictional. If it's clearly fictional or fantasy aggression, we're less likely to reproduce it. However, if it's real aggression or close to being real, then we're more likely to reproduce it. Another thing that affects it is whether we identify with the aggressor. If it's like a bad guy in a film who's being aggressive, we're less likely to go away and reproduce it because we don't identify with the bad guy. If it's the good guy in a film who is being aggressive, then we're more likely to identify with them. We're therefore more likely to go away and emulate, copy their behaviour. Another thing that affects it is whether or not the aggressor is punished. Again, this links back to social learning. If we see the consequences for the aggressor on TV or in a film being really negative consequences, we're then less likely to go away and reproduce it. But if the person who is really aggressive ends up with really positive consequences, we're more likely to reproduce it. So if they're aggressive and rob a bank and get £1 million and then go away and escape and live in the lap of luxury, we're more likely to then copy the aggressive act robbing the bank. Research, however, is conflicting. There's been lots of different research. Some of it shows that aggression is as a result of violent media. Others show that violent media has no effect whatsoever on aggression. So let's have a look at some studies. Here's some research which is more general into media rather than into computer games. And this first one is a meta-analysis. Remember, that's where they take all the studies from one area, sum them up, work out what the overall conclusion would be. And they basically found that there was a significant effect of media violence on aggression. So if you watch violence in the media, you're more likely to be aggressive. They found it wasn't a massive effect, but that there was an effect, a significant effect. And they found that for adults, the short-term effects of the media that they watched were greater, but for children, the longer-term effects were bigger. So that was a very interesting meta-analysis, which obviously claims that aggression is caused by the media. And then if we look at this one, Robertson, this is one that's in your online textbook rather than in your booklet. I've put the page number here for you, page 306. Go and have a read. It's basically a study in New Zealand over 26 years. And they were looking just not at violent TV, but at the amount of time spent watching TV. Whether watching loads and loads of TV is more likely to make you aggressive. So they're not looking at the content, they're looking at the amount that was watched. And they found that watching TV was a reliable predictor of violent and aggressive behaviour in adulthood. And this was they started measuring people from very early on until they were 26 years old. So this was a really, really long period of time that they looked at, which is really good. We'll talk about this when we look at evaluation, but a lot of these studies can only look at a really short-term effect. So that's partly why I've included this study when it's not in your booklet, because it's really good to have a longitudinal study that shows more than just a simple short-term effect. And then the third one here that I've included is this Charlton experiment. You'll see it on page 26 in your booklet on the right hand side. And this is an experiment in St Helena. In fact, it's a natural experiment where they didn't have any TV, and then it was installed in a certain year. I don't remember, 1995. They installed TV on this remote island, and everyone expected rates of aggression to go up, but in fact very little changed. There was no difference in antisocial or pro-social, i.e. positive behaviour after the introduction of TV, and that's a really unusual thing to be able to measure. We've got a remote island that has no TV. TV is then introduced. It's really interesting to be able to see what the effect of that is, and to find out that in real life actually it didn't make any difference to rates of aggression. So that's some research into media and aggression that's slightly more general. One area that the spec names that you have to know about is computer games. So let's look briefly at what research tells us about computer games. Gentile and Stone found that when they got people to play violent video games in a lab, that led to these things here: physiological arousal, being worked up, a faster heart rate and so on, hostile feelings and aggressive behaviour in the short term. And that was compared to non-violent, where they got people to play another video game that wasn't a violent one. So that was a fairly strong finding. Matthews then found that with teenagers who are playing violent video games, he did brain scans and found, and this links back to our neural factors, they had lower activity in their prefrontal lobe. If you remember, the prefrontal lobe is what regulates and controls our aggressive response, the prefrontal cortex, and actually they found there was increased activation of the amygdala. If you remember, the amygdala is activated when we have an aggressive response. It detects a threat. And so actually the fact that these teenagers who are playing violent video games did have these two things, we can see that that's really strongly, that's quite scientific, a scientific study that shows us really good facts about what's going on in our brains when we play violent video games. The last one, Anderson, 2007, another longitudinal study. This was looking at children twice in the school year, and looking at those who had high exposure to violent video games. They were measured in various ways by talking to teachers and parents and so on, and when they were surveyed for a second time towards the end of the year, they found that they were measured as being more verbally aggressive and less pro-social, less helpful. So again, that's a nice one because it's in real life and it's longitudinal. So, lots of research there, but you can see that there's a bit of conflicting evidence, perhaps more on the side of violent video games leading to aggression, but we'll obviously discuss a bit more about the other side of it when we look at our evaluation.